On today's episode, I'll go over a list of candidates for the Blackhawks' next head coach.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Blackhawks fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, please make sure to go and hit that like button. Jump in the comment section down below as well with your Mailbag Monday question, as Mailbag Monday is right around the corner and want to start stocking up on questions for next week's edition. Go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube as well if you haven't done so already. Again, it's 100% free, won't cost you anything, and really does help me out in a big way as I'm closing in on my goal of 2,000 subscribers. And last but certainly not least, got to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, which is FanDuel. Go and check out FanDuel.com right now to win $150 worth of bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins with America's #1 sportsbook. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. To open things up on the show here today with the Blackhawks, of course, joining the Bears and firing their coach during the midst of the season. Both teams are now on the hunt for their long-term replacements throughout the remainder of the season and into the offseason. And for the Blackhawks, I've already seen a good amount of names thrown around that I definitely wanted to bring up on today's show as potential candidates to be the next head coach. And by the way, do want to let you all know as well that I'm currently cooking up a dream list of Blackhawks head coaching candidates. That episode is set to drop early on next week, so make sure to keep your eyes out for that. But yeah, definitely wanted to cover a little bit of a baseline today of basically all the names that I've seen thus far and just throw a little bit of information out there about them to put them out there on your radar. First, though, I should start with current interim coach Anders Sorensen. As Blackhawks general manager Kyle Davidson did say that the final 56 games here, are going to be a trial run for Sorensen to make a case for himself as the permanent head coach. And we know he's familiar with the organization. He's been here actually for over a decade now. I believe he first joined on in 2014, officially became part of the IceHogs coaching staff as an assistant in 2018, and then has been the head coach each of the last 3 seasons, done a good job in developing a lot of players, and also has done a good job at winning at the AHL level, as the IceHogs have made the playoffs in all 3 years under Sorensen's leadership. It's only been 2 games, but seems to be preaching the right mentality right here, right now. There were some questions about, how he was going to handle the veterans as a guy that clearly was coming in to prioritize the youth and the development of those players. But so far, seems like the veterans are enjoying kind of the change-up and the shake-up in mentality. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the Blackhawks fare under Sorensen for the remainder of the season. The one thing that I will say that's working against him, though, is that Jeremy Colleton and Luke Richardson, the last permanent head coaching hires that the Blackhawks organization has made, were each first-time NHL head coaches, and Sorensen would make that 3 in a row. And just given the lack of success this team has had under that route, I quite honestly find it hard-pressed that they're going to go with a first-time NHL head coach once again, and I do expect them to hire someone with a little bit more experience. But getting into the list of names that I've seen thrown around there thus far, I'm going to start with candidates who I believe hold a little bit more weight, who are a little bit more likely to be in the conversation for the next head coach, whereas kind of the last names that I'll get into, I think, are the least likely of the group. Let's start with Gerard Gallant, though, who's had his name thrown around involving the Blackhawks head coaching job for quite a while, not only right here, right now, but going back to the last coaching hire that they were deciding upon. Gerard Gallant was a name that a lot of Blackhawks fans threw around, and for good reason. Found a lot of success everywhere he's been, never had a losing season. Florida, he did a really good job there with Vegas, took them to the Stanley Cup final in their inaugural season, took the New York Rangers in 2022 to the conference final. He knows how to win. The thing about him joining on with the Blackhawks is this is a little bit of a different spot than Gallant is used to. His teams that he's had a lot of success with that I just mentioned were a little bit more ready to go and built for a Stanley Cup playoff run, whereas if he were to join on the Blackhawks, he'd have to take them from the bottom of the barrel to get them where he's used to his teams being. So I think he's a little bit more experienced with a veteran squad that's ready to win now. So that's why personally I think it's a little unlikely that Gallant fits what the Blackhawks are looking for. Another veteran head coach who's had his name thrown out there and seemingly has his name thrown around whenever there's a head coaching vacancy is Todd McLellan, who reportedly was close to becoming the Columbus Blue Jackets head coach over the summer, was fired by the Los Angeles Kings last February. But another guy who's had a lot of success everywhere he's been. Started off as a video coach actually under Mike Babcock with Detroit and won a Stanley Cup with them in 2008. Then took over as the San Jose Sharks head coach. And even though that team didn't find a ton of playoff success, they were phenomenal always in the regular season. I think a couple of President's Cups under McLellan, usually one of the top seeds in the Western Conference. Also had a pretty good run with the Edmonton Oilers. So I think there is a good chance that the Blackhawks look into someone like Todd McLellan because of all of his experience, known as a good defensive-minded head coach, which I think could intrigue Kyle Davidson as well, considering the group of defensemen and the prospects that this front office has been able to accumulate. So I think Todd McLellan could be a very interesting candidate. Jay Woodcroft is another name who's been thrown around, even though he only has one full season of being an NHL head coach under his belt, 2 half seasons. But in that time, he went 79, 41, and 13 with the Oilers. But unfortunately, a poor stretch out of the gate last year, 3, 9, and 1 through their opening 13 games, ultimately led to him being fired. But he's another guy who had good experience to start off his coaching career. He was with Todd McLellan in Detroit and won a Stanley Cup together under Mike Babcock. Also won a Calder Cup championship with Bakersfield before getting the interim gig, actually, because Todd McLellan was fired. And some of you may remember Todd McLellan's last game as Oilers head coach actually came against the Chicago Blackhawks. Not a ton of NHL head coaching experience for Woodcroft, but he's been around stars. He's been around the development level at the AHL scene. So I think Jay Woodcroft could be an interesting candidate as well, and does have a decent amount of winning experience, at least at every level he's been at. Bruce Boudreau, another guy who's had his name thrown around there, coached for Washington, Anaheim, Minnesota, and most recently Vancouver. Is a former Jack Adams Award winner, beloved guy in the locker room, and a real solid coach too. He's got the 11th best points percentage in NHL history with in coaches who have coached over 200 games. Really good locker room guy. However, he has only been past the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs once. That came in 2015 when his Anaheim Ducks were knocked off in the Western Conference Final against the Chicago Blackhawks. But he's a good offensive-minded coach, been around a lot of good young-minded offensive players, so could be a good guy to mentor Connor Bedard. But there is a little bit of a wonder if the NHL in this era has kind of came and went with Bruce Boudreau, given how things ended with him in Vancouver. Former Blackhawk assistant coach Don Granato has also had his name thrown around, was an assistant under Joel Quenneville and remained on staff when Quenneville got fired under Jeremy Colleton, and then was a first-time head coach for the Buffalo Sabres the last couple of years from 2020 to 2024, but ultimately ended up getting fired after the end of last year. But he did tally at least 75 points in his 3 full seasons as Sabres head coach. He obviously knows the Blackhawks organization, familiar with a full-scale type of rebuild that the Buffalo Sabres were going through as well. Did kind of underwhelm in his last year as the Sabres head coach, as the team didn't take that step like a lot of people expected, but a pretty decent first NHL head coaching stint for Don Granato, considering the situation. And like I mentioned, does, of course, have ties to this Blackhawks organization. So those are kind of the veteran coaches who I think have a chance to be in the mix for the next Blackhawks head coach. A young guy who doesn't have very much NHL experience whatsoever that I do think could be a good option, though, is Todd Nelson, who's been an NHL assistant for 7 years, also has 11 years as an AHL head coach. The only NHL coaching experience he has was a 46-game stint, but he's turned the Hershey Bears into an absolute wagon. They've won the Calder Cup each of the last 2 years. They're off to a great start, making a charge for a three-peat again this year. He's very familiar with the development level. Like I said, 11 years in Washington, churned out a lot of good pros to get up to the NHL scene, and he's also managed to win at the same time. Development and winning. Sounds like what the Chicago Blackhawks would like to be doing right here, right now. Again, I think given his lack of NHL head coaching experience, it's a little bit of an outside chance. But if they were to go with an outside-the-box type of candidate, I think Todd Nelson is a really good option. David Carl is also a name I've seen around by a couple of people. I did read a good article by Tab Bamford from Bleacher Nation Blackhawks. He's been the head coach of Denver in the NCAA for each of the last 7 years. Actually took over after Jim Montgomery was the Denver head coach, but ultimately got promoted to the NHL. And Carl has been phenomenal. He's led the Pioneers to a 148, 62, and 16 record, 5 NCAA tournament appearances in 6 years, 3 Frozen Fours, 2 national championships. When he was hired, he was only 28 and was, at the time, the youngest head coach in all of Division I hockey. Youngest coach in college hockey history to ever win 2 national championships. And was also the coach of the United States World Junior team last winter that won the gold medal. And who was on that team? Frank Nazar, Oliver Moore, Sam Renzel, Gavin Hayes. We know he's familiar with Aiden Thompson because he's coaching him at Denver. Also familiar with Cole Gutman. It's a really impressive resume for David Carl. But again, it still would be a first-time NHL head coaching hire. But the two outside-the-box type candidates, if they don't go with a veteran guy with experience, I think Todd Nelson and David Carl are the two candidates, in my opinion. Jeff Blashill is another name that's been thrown around. He was the Red Wings head coach from 2015 to 2022. Made the playoffs his first season, but that was kind of an aging roster that he took over, and then the Wings went on to miss the playoffs 6 consecutive years under his leadership and never hit 80 points once. He does have experience with a full-scale rebuild over there, though, and, the Steve Yzer plan, and has spent the last 3 years as an assistant under John Cooper with the Tampa Bay Lightning, which has made him an intriguing candidate. Some folks on the hockey scene think. So Blashill's a name that's been thrown around there. Same with Dave Quinn, who's coached in the NHL for 5 years, 3 years for the Sharks, 2 years for the Rangers, but never reached 80 points, never made the playoffs. Currently an assistant with Pittsburgh, where things aren't really going very swimmingly there. So I don't think it's likely that Dave Quinn's going to be in the mix. Jay Leach is another name I've seen thrown around, was a Kraken assistant from 2021 to 2024 under Dave Haxtell, who I'll get to here in just a second. Currently the assistant coach of the Boston Bruins, was there along with Jim Montgomery, and has remained as an assistant since Joe Sacco has took over. But he only has a couple years of experience of head coaching. Even at the AHL level, it was only for a couple years with the Providence Bruins. I just don't think there's enough experience there for Jay Leach to be the Blackhawks next coaching guy, even though a lot of hockey folks think he's a very sought-after assistant that's bound to be a first-time NHL head coach sooner rather than later. And last but certainly not least, Dave Haxtell, who spent 3 years coaching the Seattle Kraken, did help them reach the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs in just their second year as a franchise, but failed to get back there in the third year, and that ultimately led to Haxtell being fired. He was also a head coach for the Philadelphia Flyers for 3 years, 2015 to 2018, before taking over as an assistant for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Some decent experience, but not a really sound track record, not a ton of experience that I think is going to intrigue the Blackhawks enough. So honestly, Blashill, Quinn, Leach, Haxtell, I think are unlikely candidates. The first, 8 candidates that I mentioned, I think are the more likely ones of the group. But there are some of the names that have been thrown out there in the hockey community as candidates to be the next head coach of the Blackhawks. And again, I am personally cooking up my dream list of probably 5 candidates that I think that episode is going to be dropping early on next week. Make sure to keep your eyes out for that. Coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, I'll talk about the side effects of this team firing head coach Luke Richardson. Real quick, though, I do got to talk to you all about the fine folks over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action in the second half of the regular season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and win $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. And the FanDuel Sportsbook app now gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place, so that when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you also happen to place your bets. Chicago Bears did not get the interim coaching boost I thought they were going to get, like we're hoping to get for our Chicago Blackhawks. I think the wise strategy is to probably just fade the Chicago Bears the rest of the way. If you agree that's the right strategy, make sure to go and check out FanDuel.com right now. You'll have a chance to win $150 worth of bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. Back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Again, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen. Here to start off your day. For your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast, so that you can become a fantasy hockey expert to get the edge over your league mates with daily tips, from Steal and Flip. And you can easily find the link to Locked On Fantasy Hockey down in the description of this video, or you can search on YouTube and wherever you may be listening to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Segment 2, one thing I really haven't been able to talk about because of all the chaos that's been going on involving the Blackhawks in the past week. Luke Richardson getting fired, Anders Sorensen taking over, the new style, the new mentality, the Blackhawks looking better against the New York Rangers, Taylor Hall, Tyler Bertuzzi having their best games of the season, Wyatt Kaiser, Alex Vlasic looking great, Kevin Korchinski getting called up. There's been a lot going on in the past week, and because of that, I haven't really got to talk about Mark Eaton, who is, by the way, the only NHL player to ever come from Delaware. Interestingly enough, I found that out when doing a little bit more research on him here today. Mark Eaton, for those of you who don't know, is the assistant general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks, does have a ton of hockey experience, has been in a couple different roles since joining on with the Blackhawks organization, played 13 years in the NHL, I think 15 or 16 years of pro hockey experience, but he's the assistant general manager. And when Anders Sorensen was promoted to the big league squad, that left the Rockford IceHogs in a little bit of a precarious position. They are now down a head coach. And the Blackhawks made the interesting decision to name Mark Eaton as the IceHogs interim head coach, despite not having a lick of coaching experience. And it seems like the IceHogs are suffering so far because of it, as they fell 5-0 last night to the Iowa Wild and are now 0-2-1 in 3 games since Mark Eaton took over, with only 1 single goal scored. And I know it doesn't also help that Kevin Korchinski was just called up, Louis Crevier's up there, as well as Wyatt Kaiser and Nolan Allen, 2 guys who could have been at the AHL level this year. Drew Commesso is up at the NHL scene once again and hasn't been able to consistently stay down in Rockford to develop here during his sophomore season. All of that ties into this poor stretch since Mark Eaton has taken over. But you got to kind of wonder, especially when I've been seeing tweets from the Rinkside General, someone who I shout out a ton here on the show. Make sure to go and subscribe to the Rinkside General on YouTube. Follow him on X. Ton of great Blackhawks insight and video breakdowns and strategy. Just a lot of unique content there. And definitely follow at Shy Prospects on X if you don't as well. Another great source to keep up with Blackhawks prospects and updates and whatnot. Posts a lot of clips from stuff down in Rockford, and there just hasn't been a lot of good stuff coming from the IceHogs in the past week since Mark Eaton took over. And I know Rob Klinkhammer, former IceHogs legend, he doesn't have very much experience as the assistant coach down there, but you got to wonder if they kind of made the wrong decision here with Mark Eaton. I know it's kind of too early to say, but it's a head-scratching decision regardless of the results. An assistant general manager taking over as the interim head coach despite having no experience. I don't know if Klinkhammer would have been any better or led to any different results. Maybe they could have gone with someone like Yannick Perreault, who's been on the development staff, or someone else down there in Rockford other than a guy from up in the front office. But yeah, you got to wonder kind of what's going on down there in Rockford and how this is going to impact the development of some of those players down there, like Frank Nazar, Colton Dock. I mean, I know there are a lot of guys called up right now, but there are still some important players down at the AHL scene. Got to wonder what's going to happen down there. And no one really, I think, has been talking about this side effect of firing Luke Richardson, because now it's left Rockford in a very precarious situation. And as I mentioned, when going through the potential coaching candidates for the Blackhawks the rest of the way and into the offseason, Sorensen has found a ton of success down there in Rockford, not only developing players, but putting them in the Calder Cup playoffs. So Blackhawks could have jeopardized the good thing they've had going down in Rockford because they fired head coach Luke Richardson. I know the NHL group takes precedent over the AHL group, but it's still kind of putting the Blackhawks in another weird situation, which they're trying to get out of those. So it's going to be curious to see what happens down in Rockford. Hopefully they'll be able to pick it up, but since Eaton stepped in, it hasn't been good, and the Hogs were humming before then. They were 4-1-2-0 in their 7 games previous to that and looked like they had been finding their stride. Frank Nazar was absolutely sizzling. Colton Dock was on a good run, getting better play out of Kevin Korchinski. So definitely got to keep an eye on what's been going down in Rockford here. Hopefully they'll be able to kind of put an end to that schneid and solve some of the issues and get a couple of wins over the weekend. But definitely wanted to be sure to mention what's going on down in Rockford right now, and a side effect that not a lot of people are talking about because they fired Luke Richardson during the middle of the season. Coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, before I wrap things up, I still have to get into a preview of tonight's matchup with the New York Islanders. But first, I do got to talk to you all real quick about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. And Prize Picks is now now the easiest and most exciting way for you to play daily fantasy sports, because all you got to do is simply select more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. Do you think Connor Bedard will score more than 0.5 goals tonight against the New York Islanders? Or how about the total going over 5.5 goals? You can now cook up hot takes with your friends and win real money this hockey season when you and your crew run your game with Prize Picks. And one thing I really do enjoy about Prize Picks is it's the only real daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy so that your lineups stay in play even if a player were to get injured. So make sure to download the Prize Picks app and use the code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the Prize Picks app, use the code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps to get a free $50 when you put $5 down. Prize Picks, run your game. Segment 3, back in action are the Blackhawks here this evening as they'll look to build off of Anders Sorensen's first NHL head coaching victory against the Rangers, as they'll remain in the Empire State here tonight to take on the New York Islanders with a 6:30 p.m. Central Time puck drop. I know the last game against the Rangers was at 6. Tonight's going to be at 6:30 p.m. Central Time, and getting to know a little bit more about the opponent. The Islanders are 11-12-7 through their opening 30 games. I believe almost half of their games have gone to overtime this year. You know the infamous style of play in which they like to go about things. They are currently only 1 point back of a playoff spot out in the Eastern Conference, but have played a lot more games than most of their opponents. They actually have the 6th worst points percentage in the entire Eastern Conference. 2-2-1 over their past 5 games here in the month of December, coming off of a 3-1 loss at UBS Arena in Long Island in their last time out. They're pretty banged up as well. One thing I should definitely note here off the jump is they're expected to be without Matt Barzal, who's been out for quite a while now. Anthony Duclair's missed most of the early part of the season after signing a pretty good ticket with the Islanders in the offseason. Adam Pellick's out on the back end, same with Mike Riley. So definitely a depleted Islander squad that the Hawks are going to be going up against here tonight and trying to pick up their first set of back-to-back victories in nearly a month's time. Diving into some of the numbers for the New York Islanders this year, not good in the special teams department, which could be a huge boost to the Blackhawks, who, despite being at the bottom of the standings, have been excellent in the special teams department this year. The Islanders are 31st in the NHL on the power play, converting on just 13% of their opportunities, and dead last, 32nd in the league on the penalty kill with just a 66% success rate. Blackhawks should have a huge advantage on both. The Hawks' power play is 11th in the NHL this year at 23%. The penalty kill has been exquisite. They're now up to 6th in the NHL at 82% on the year, and have also killed off 24 of 26 penalties during their past 10 games. The one category that is hugely sloped in the Islanders' favor, though, is at the faceoff dot. The Isles are the best team in the NHL at the dot, winning 55% of the faceoffs, where the Blackhawks are the 3rd worst team in the NHL, winning just 44% of their faceoffs. And they got worked pretty good on Monday last time out against the New York Islanders. So they're definitely going to have to batten down the hatches a little bit and try to not get absolutely smoked and have the puck as much as possible. In terms of goals for per game, we know the Isles are right there with the Blackhawks. They don't push the pace. They don't score a ton of goals. Islanders are 28th in the NHL, scoring 2.53 goals per game. Goals against, they're 15th, allowing 2.97 goals per game. The Blackhawks, 30th, just behind the Islanders offensively, and with 2.39 goals per game. And right behind them defensively as well, 20th, allowing 3.11 goals per game. Diving into some individual statistics for the Islanders, Anders Lee, their captain, is also their leading scorer this season with 13 goals, along with 11 assists for 24 points. Kyle Palmieri and Bo Horvat are the other 2 players that have reached 20 points so far this year. Palmieri's got 23. Bo Horvat has 21. Noah Dobson is the only defender for the Islanders that's in double-digit points. And oddly enough, looking at their statistics defensively from their defensemen offensively, it's very similar to the Blackhawks. Don't get a lot of chipping in, not a whole lot of goal scoring from the back end, but the Blackhawks have been much better with that, of course, in their 2 games under Anders Sorensen, with the defensemen have been much more involved. Diving into the Islanders' projected lineup for tonight's game, as I mentioned, no Barzal, no Duclair, no Pelech, no Mike Riley. Top line looks like it's going to be Maxim Siplikov, I believe is how you pronounce that. Admittedly, not all that familiar with him. Bo Horvat, top line center, J.G. Pageau. Honestly, writing this Islanders lineup down, the Blackhawks obviously don't play them very much each and every year, only two appearances against the Islanders. I forget half of these guys are still in the NHL. J.G. Pageau, Anders Lee, I'm still familiar with. Brock Nelson, I talked about last week, a surprise on the United States Four Nations roster. Kyle Palmieri, I honestly forgot about him. Simone Holmstrom's on the third line. Casey Cizikas, I forgot he was still there. Pierre Engvall, forgot he was still there. Matt Martin still there as well down on the fourth line, along with Kyle McLean and Oliver Wahlstrom, who they're still hoping will find some success at the NHL scene, despite his style of play not fitting in with the organization regardless, which should make it very interesting once that Cole Iserman fellow reaches the pro scene as well. Defensively for the Islanders, Dennis Cholowski and Noah Dobson look like they're going to be the top pairing tonight. Alexander Romanov and Ryan Pulock as the second pairing, and then Isaiah George and Scott Mayfield as the third defensive pairing. Ilya Sorokin has been announced as the starter. He's the strength. He's the backbone of this team. 2.58 goals against average so far this year. Semyon Varlamov as their backup also has a goals against below 3 as well. Figure this is going to be a low-scoring contest between these two teams. 7 of the last 9 games between these two opponents, between these two squads. I guess they're not two opponents, but 7 of the last 9 games between these teams since the start of 2019 has gone under 5.5. As far as the Blackhawks lineup, we don't have any confirmation as of the time of this recording, but based on their lines and pairings during practice yesterday at UBS Arena, looks like it's going to be pretty similar to what we saw against the Rangers, meaning Kurashev, Bedard, and Mikheyev are still going to serve as the top line. I honestly don't hate giving Mikheyev another opportunity there like some people do, but man, Philip Kurashev just needs to be better. He's been so bad this year. Taylor Hall, Ryan Donato, Tyler Bertuzzi, best trio for the Blackhawks against the Rangers. Got to keep them together once again tonight and hope to get the same kind of energy and aggressiveness and performance. Nick Foligno, Jason Dickinson, and Teuvo Teravainen serving as the shutdown line. Just wish Teuvo Teravainen had some more confidence with the puck right now because he is not making an impact whatsoever. I do believe Craig Smith is going to draw back into the Blackhawks lineup after Joey Anderson got in there against the Rangers, leaving Pat Maroon, Lucas Reichel, and Craig Smith down as the fourth line, hoping they get a good opportunity tonight against the Islanders. Defensively for the Blackhawks, think it's going to be the same pairings. Vlasic and Kaiser, who are marvelous together in their first game with one another. Kaiser on the offside played splendidly and has been playing marvelous hockey the last few weeks. Nolan Allen and Connor Murphy look like they're going to serve as the second pairing once again. Murph with a real good game against in Madison Square Garden against the Rangers on Monday. And then Kevin Korchinski going to be in the lineup for a second consecutive game on the third pairing with TJ Brody to round things out defensively. No confirmation on Arvid Soderblom, but he was awesome once again against the Rangers. I think you got to ride him again here tonight against the Isles. But as I mentioned earlier on in the week, with the Blackhawks having a back-to-back against the Devils at noon on Saturday, and then back at the UC as they return home against this Islanders squad again on Sunday at 2 p.m. Central Time, Drew Commesso is going to have to get the start in one of those two games. So expect to see number 33, the top Blackhawks goaltender prospect, in my opinion, make his NHL debut over the weekend. But I do expect Arvid Soderblom to get the nod here again tonight. That's going to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks. Everyone, as always, thank you all again for joining me on the show. Be sure to go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube if you haven't done so already. Truly means the world to me, and I really do appreciate all of your support. Go and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free wherever you may listen to your podcast as well, so that you can listen to the podcast when you're on the go, on the drive to or from work, or during your lunch break. If you want to check me out on X, you can find my personal at Jack Bushman 2, but you got to follow at Talkin' Hockey so that way you can get all of the latest Blackhawks news and updates. So until tomorrow's episode, everyone, have a great rest of your day. Go Hawks. Would be awesome to pick up a second win in a row. Honestly, even if they don't, I just want to see a good style of play like we saw on Monday against the Rangers. Hopefully that's what I'll be talking about on tomorrow's episode. Until then, have a good one. I'll see you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.